The date is January 27th of 1944. The location is the Ayaspaşa district of Istanbul, a neighborhood clinging to the European bank of the Bosphorus Strait, where the wind cuts down from the Black Sea with the bite of a butcher's knife. The weather reports for that week record a chill that seeped through the thickest wool coats, a dampness that turned the cobblestones into slick, treacherous mirrors, reflecting the dim wartime streetlights. In an apartment overlooking the strait, a young couple is dressing for a party. The man, Erich Vermehren, is 24 years old. He is thin and wears glasses, with the fragile intensity of someone who had seen too much of the world's ugliness too soon. He fastens his cufflinks. He adjusts his dinner jacket. He looks like a man preparing for a night of champagne and diplomatic small talk. His wife, the Countess Elisabeth von Plattenberg, is 13 years his senior. She wears an evening gown, perhaps checking her reflection in the mirror one last time, ensuring the mask is perfectly in place. They are the golden couple of the German diplomatic mission in Turkey. He is a rising star in the Abwehr, the military intelligence service of the Third Reich. She is the cousin of a German ambassador, Franz von Papen. To the outside world, they are the aristocracy of the New Order. But the air in the apartment does not smell of perfume or expensive tobacco. It smells of fear. They tell their colleagues they are attending a reception at the Spanish embassy, a safe harbor for Axis sympathizers, a place of warmth and neutral ground. It is the perfect cover. In Istanbul, the city of whispers, everyone is always going to a party, and everyone is always lying about which one. They step out into the cold night. They walk towards the waiting car. But they never arrive at the Spanish embassy. By the time the sun rises over the minarets of the Hagia Sophia, Erich and Elisabeth Vermehren will have vanished. Their disappearance will not be a quiet exit. It will be a seismic event. It will cause Adolf Hitler to explode in a rage that shakes the wolf's lair. It will lead to the arrest of mothers and fathers in Berlin. It will trigger the complete destruction of the German military intelligence service, blinding the Wehrmacht just months before the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy. And in a final, tragic twist that neither Erich nor Elizabeth can foresee, their act of conscience, their desperate bid to help the good Germany, will be hijacked by a traitor in London, turning their gift of intelligence into a death warrant for hundreds of Catholic resistors they left behind. This is not a story about maps or troop movements. It is a story about the price of a soul in a world that has lost its mind. It is the story of how a tea party in Berlin, a friendship in London, and a motor launch in the Aegean Sea conspired to break the back of the Nazi war machine. To understand the magnitude of what happened that night, we must first immerse ourselves in the sensory overload of Istanbul in 1944. This was not a city on the periphery of war. It was the eye of the hurricane. While Europe burned, Turkey remained stubbornly, precariously neutral. This neutrality made Istanbul the only place on earth where the combatants could look each other in the eye. The geography of espionage, the city was physically divided, a perfect metaphor for the schizophrenia of the intelligence war. To the south lay the old city, Istanbul, a labyrinth of mosques and markets. To the north, across the Golden Horn, lay Pura, the European quarter. This was the domain of spies. The main artery of Pura was the Istiklal Caddesi, then known for the Grande Rue de Paris. It was a river of neon and noise. Here the Axis and the Allies maintained their consulates, often within shouting distance of one another. The British consulate was a fortress of stone. The German consulate was a hive of nervous energy. At the center of it all stood the Pura Palace Hotel. The Pura Palace was not just a hotel, it was a demilitarized zone with a liquor license. The air inside was thick with the smoke of Turkish tobacco, heavy and sweet. The furniture was velvet, the chandeliers dripped crystal, and the bar was the confessional of the espionage world. At the Orient Bar, you could order Iraqi, the anise-flavored lion's milk that turns cloudy when you add water, and watch the enemy. The research tells us that atmosphere was so saturated with agents that when a group of Americans entered the club, the band would strike up into the popular tune, "Boo Boo Baby, I'm a Spy." It was a joke, but nobody laughed. The hotel had hosted Mata Hari and Agatha Christie. Now it hosted men like Paul Leverkusen, the station chief of the Abwehr, and Nicholas Elliott of MI6. They were gentlemen spies who might nod at each other in the lobby before sending agents to cut each other's throats in the alleyways. Beneath the glamour, there was a brutal economic war. The currency was information, but the commodity was chrome. Turkey possessed massive reserves of high-grade chrome, essential for hardening the steel of panzer tanks and Spitfire engines. Both sides were bidding for it. The Germans paid with gold looted from the central banks of occupied Europe. The British paid with promises and preemptive purchases. In this environment, a man like Erich Vermehren was a high-value asset. As a junior trade attaché and Abwehr agent, he sat at the intersection of commerce and intelligence. He knew who was buying, who was selling, and who crucially was wavering. The Germans in Istanbul were not a unified front. They were split into two deadly rival gangs. The Abwehr, run by the German military, headed globally by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris and locally by Paul Leverkusen. These men were often conservative, aristocratic, and educated. Many despised the Nazis as vulgar upstarts. They served the fatherland, not the Führer. By 1944, the Abwehr in Istanbul was a house of mirrors. Many of its officers knew the war was lost and were secretly putting out feelers to the British. The SD, the intelligence arm of the SS run by Heinrich Himmler and represented in Turkey by men like Ludwig Milosevic, these were ideological fanatics. They viewed the Abwehr as a nest of defeatists and traitors. They spent more time spying on their German colleagues than on the British. Erich Vermehren was an unlikely spy. Born in 1919 in Lübeck, he came from a family of Hasidic lawyers, men of rules, order, and deep morale. He was physically slight, fragile in body due to a childhood gunshot accident that had left him with a permanent injury. This injury saved him from the meat grinder of the Eastern Front, but it also isolated him. He could not prove his manhood in the trenches, so he had to prove it in an arena of conscience. His defining moment came in 1938. He had won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, a dream for a young intellectual. But the Nazi Party blocked him. They declared him unfit to represent German youth because he had repeatedly refused to join the Hitler Youth. This rejection was a scar. It told him exactly where he stood. He was an enemy of the state before he had even lifted a finger. In 1939, he converted to Catholicism. This was not a casual Sunday decision. In the Third Reich, becoming a devout Catholic was a political act. It aligned him with a power higher than Hitler. It gave him a morale framework that made treason not just permissible but mandatory. Elisabeth was 13 years older than Erich. She came from the Plattenberg family, Westphalian nobility with deep Catholic roots. She was not a bystander. In 1937, She'd been involved in distributing the papal encyclical Mitbrenbender Sorge, a blistering critique of Nazism that had been smuggled into Germany and read from the pulpits. Her parents had been imprisoned by the Gestapo for weeks because of this. Elizabeth knew the inside of an interrogation room. When Erich was posted to Istanbul, the Gestapo held her hostage in Germany to ensure his loyalty. It took the intervention of her cousin, Ambassador Franz von Papen, to get her a visa. She arrived in Istanbul not as a dependent wife, but as a co-conspirator. She was the driving force behind the defection, the one who stiffened Erich's spine when he wavered about the safety of their parents. Across the lines stood Nicholas Elliot. He wore a three-piece suit, radiating the reassuring Englishness. He was the son of the headmaster of Eton. He viewed the war as a cricket match played with live ammunition. Elliot's genius was his ability to charm. He didn't recruit Vermehren with threats. He recruited him with empathy. He recognized that Vermehren was a spiritually displaced person, a man who belonged to the civilized world of Oxford, not to the barbaric world of Berlin. Hovering over the entire operation was Kim Philby. In 1944, Philby was the head of Section 5 counterintelligence for the Iberian Peninsula and a rising star in MI6. He was also Nicholas Elliot's best friend. They drank together, joked together, and shared every secret. Philby was a Soviet mole. He had been recruited by the NKVD in the 1930s. Every piece of intelligence Elliot sent him, including the details of the Vermehren defection, was passed to Moscow. Philby is the third man in this tragedy, the invisible puppeteer who would turn a tragic tactical victory into a moral disaster. The decision to defect was not impulsive. It was forced by a specific terrifying event in Berlin. The Solf Circle was a group of anti-Nazi intellectuals who met at the home of Hanna Solf, the widow of a former diplomat. They were not bomb throwers, they were tea drinkers. They gathered to discuss a post-Hitler Germany, to help Jews immigrate, and to keep the flame of civilized culture alive. On September 10th of 1943, the circle met for a birthday party. Among the guests was a man named Dr. Paul Rekes. He claimed to be a sympathetic doctor from the Charter Hospital, eager to help. But he asked questions. He nodded at the seditious talk. He was, of course, a Gestapo informant. The trap took months to close. In January of 1944, the Gestapo struck. They arrested Otto Kiep, a high official in the Foreign Office and a member of the Circle. Otto Kiep was a mentor and friend of Erich Vermehren. The news reached Istanbul like a shockwave. We can infer from the mechanism a coded telegram or a courier message, likely from Erich's cousin, Adam von Schrott, another high-ranking diplomat and secret resistor. The message was clear: Kiep is taken. The network is compromised. They are coming for everyone. This is the moment the existential stakes became personal. It was no longer a theoretical opposition to Hitler. It was a race. Erich knew the under torture, the names that would be named. He would be recalled to Berlin for consultations. He would step off the train at the Anhalter Bahnhof, and two men in leather coats would be waiting. He had days, perhaps hours, to act. The recruitment of Erich Vermehren is a case study in psychological operations. It began with a fumble. Early in the war, while in Lisbon, Erich had made a clumsy approach to the British. It had been rejected, but the file had crossed Kim Philby's desk. Philby, seeing an opportunity to penetrate the Abwehr, had flagged it. When Vermehren arrived in Istanbul in late 1943, Nicholas Elliot was waiting. The meeting took place in December. It was clandestine, dangerous, and dripping with atmosphere. Erich slipped away from the Abwehr handlers and made his way to an apartment on Istiklal Caddesi. We must visualize this scene. The apartment did not belong to Elliot. It was a safe house. When Erich knocked, the door was not opened by a soldier but by a servant with a strong Russian accent, who handed him a large scotch. This detail, the Russian servant, is a deep cut that adds a layer of surrealism to the encounter. It signals that in Istanbul, nothing is what it seems. Then Elliot emerged. He didn't ask for codes. He didn't ask for maps. He smiled and said, "Erich Vermehren? Why, I believe you were coming up to Oxford." It was the perfect opening. It bypassed the war entirely. It connected them as men of the same class, the same education, the same values. It made the betrayal of Germany feel like a return to civilization. Over the next few weeks, the dance intensified. Erich began to smuggle documents out of the Abwehr office. He couldn't take them permanently, they would be missed. So he developed a routine. He would take the files at the end of the day, meet Elliot or a courier in the dark alley of a safe house, and the British would photograph them overnight. Erich would return them before the office opened the next morning. These were the Pasha reports. They were summaries of intelligence the Abwehr was sending to Berlin about the Middle East. For the British, they were invaluable. They showed exactly what the Germans believed was happening. If you know the enemy's delusions, you can feed them. But this game couldn't last. The Self-Circle arrest meant the Gestapo was closing in. The kidnapping plan was born. Erich and Elisabeth knew that if they defected openly, their families would be punished. But if they were kidnapped by the ruthless British, perhaps their families would be spared. They chose the night of January 27th of 1944. The cover story was the reception at a Spanish embassy. It was plausible, social, and public. The execution was flawed, messy, and terrifyingly human. They left their apartment in the evening clothes, but instead of embassy, they were met by British agents. Here, their narrative must break their linear timeline to explain the geography of the escape. You cannot simply drive from Istanbul to Cairo. The journey required a complex chain of custody. They were driven out of Istanbul, likely smuggled across the Bosphorus Strait to the Asian side to avoid the main German checkpoints. They were moved south toward the coast. The research mentions a fast motor launch from the Simir. This implies a long overland journey or a clandestine flight to the coast. The Aegean Sea in January is a cauldron of dark waves and freezing spray. They boarded the launch. We can imagine the sensory experience, the roar of the engines drowning out the conversation, the taste of salt, the sheer physical misery of being in a tuxedo and gown on a small boat in the high seas. They did not go to Cyprus, but directly to the Allied territory, eventually landing in Cairo. They arrived in Cairo 24 hours later. Two young aristocrats, shivering, exhausted, standing on a dock in Egypt, still wearing their party clothes. The final masquerade was finally over. The reality of exile had begun. In Cairo, and later in London, the debriefing began. Erich Vermehren held back nothing. He was eager to prove that he was not a traitor to Germany, but a soldier in the war against Hitler. He gave Elliot the Catholic list. This was a list of key figures in the Catholic underground in Germany, men and women who were resisting the regime and who Erich believed could form a backbone of a new democratic government. He gave these names to the British to protect them, to ensure they would be recognized as allies when the war ended. Eliot, dutiful and trusting, sent this list to London, marked for the attention of the head of Section 5. Kim Philby received the list. Philby did not see allies, he saw obstacles. He knew that Stalin wanted a pro-Soviet Germany after the war. A strong, organized, Catholic, democratic resistance was a threat to Soviet ambitions. Philby copied the names. He passed them to his Soviet handler. The list was transmitted to Moscow. The consequences were horrific. As the Red Army advanced into Germany, and as the Gestapo intensified its own purges, the people on that list began to die. Some were arrested by the Nazis, perhaps tipped off via complex double agent loops. Others were liquidated by the Soviets as they liberated territory. While Philby was burying the future of the Catholic resistance, Hitler was burying the Abwehr. The news of the defection hit Berlin like a V-2 rocket. The British, ruthlessly pragmatic, decided to blow the Vermehrens' kidnapping cover. They broadcast the defection on the BBC. They wanted to sow chaos in the German ranks, and they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Hitler went nuts. The fact that Vermehren was a relative of von Papen, a Catholic, and an Abwehr agent confirmed his darkest paranoia. The entire aristocratic class was against him. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, was summoned. Canaris was a legend, the little admiral, the spy master, but he had been protecting anti-Nazis for years. The Vermehren affair was the final proof of his incompetence or his treachery. On February 18th of 1944, Hitler signed the decree. The Abwehr was dissolved. Its assets, its agents, and its files were transferred to the RSHA, the Reich Main Security Office, under Himmler and the Kaltenbrunner. This was the strategic catastrophe for Germany. The RSHA was a political police force, not a military intelligence agency. They didn't know how to run foreign networks. They purged the experienced Abwehr officers. They alienated the double agents. The result was blindness. When the Allies launched Operation Fortitude, the massive deception campaign to convince the Germans that the D-Day landings would happen at the Pas de Calais, there was no one left in Berlin with the skill to spot the lie. The new SD chiefs accepted the fake reports because they fit their ideological worldview. The Vermehren defection didn't just steal secrets, it broke the machine that analyzed them. It left the Atlantic Wall undefended where it mattered most. Erich's mother, Petra Vermehren, was a journalist stationed in Lisbon. When Erich defected, the British urged her to join him. She refused. She was a woman of immense pride and perhaps naivety. She believed that by returning to Germany voluntarily, she could prove the family's loyalty and save them from retribution. She thought she could beat the Gestapo at their own game. She flew back to Berlin. She was arrested almost immediately. The Gestapo invoked Sippenhaft. Petra was sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Erich's father, Kurt, was arrested. Elizabeth's family, the Plattenbergs, were rounded up. They spent the rest of their war in camps. It is a testament to the chaotic collapse of the Reich that they were not executed. They survived, emaciated and broken, to be liberated in 1945. But Erich lived with the knowledge of their suffering. He had bought his freedom with their imprisonment. Erich and Elisabeth Vermehren never returned to Germany alive. They settled in London, where Erich worked as a broker for Lloyd's under the name Erich Maria de Saventham. Later, they moved to Switzerland. They dedicated their lives to the traditionalist Catholic movement, founding the Una Voce Federation, fighting to preserve the Latin Mass. It was a strange, quiet end for a man who had helped destroy the Third Reich. He had seen the ultimate evil of the modern world, and he retreated into the ancient certainty of the Church. Nicholas Elliot rose to the top of MI6, only to have his heart broken by Philby's defection in 1963. He realized, decades too late, that the man he drank with while debriefing Vermehren had been the enemy all along.